things. We do have 11 to Life's Grace King, who's been in the courtroom following this case very closely. Grace also out at Appalachia 2 years ago when this went down. Grace, full circle moment for you. We are seeing a closing to something that has been so hard for so many families, the friends, just people across the state and the country watching this. Can you just give us your first take from what that feeling was like in the room, and what now? Now that this has come down, what now for these families?
Well, it's been a long 2 years to get to this point in the legal process, but the feeling today is just heavy. We heard some of the families say, it's not fair, but we're going to have to accept it. This isn't the sentence they were hoping for, but it is a hefty sentence. And when Colin's attorneys were talking about it, they said, he's 55, 15 years, he will be 70. The judge says he does not have many concerns about him reoffending in the future, and that he felt this was the appropriate sentence because Colin, his inaction, his lack of action is more of what caused this crime, not an intent to commit a crime. But it's a heavy day in here. It's an emotional day in here. A lot of the families took their time leaving the courtroom, just kind of breaking down in tears, looking at each other, knowing that this is not the sentence they wanted for this father's case.
Grace, we heard from some of the family members before the sentencing. I was listening to Junior Angulo, the brother of 14-year-old Christian, and one thing that stood out to me is he said, our families are facing a lifelong sentence of grief, and I think that's what the emotion in the courtroom, balancing that out, and the what-ifs being so painful. We heard the judge talking, his phrase was, but for not buying that gun, but for putting it in a safe. Can you talk about who else was in the room and the sense you got about the judge's attempts to explain why he was doing what he was doing?
Well, the judge made it very clear several times. This is the first of its case in Georgia, only the second that he knows of in the entire country. So he had to really, there's no, legal precedent for how long a parent really should sit in jail for a crime. At the end of the day, their child's carried out. So he said, it's the first of his kind, and he had to sit there and think about each thing that happened or didn't happen. He said there were two versions in his mind. Colin bought Colt a gun. Colin didn't get him mental health. That facts doesn't change. But there is a version of that story where Colt changes his mind. He doesn't go to Appalachia High School that day. This shooting doesn't happen, and Colin isn't facing any crimes. Unfortunately, the version that happened is Colt did go to school that day. He did shoot up Appalachia High School, and for that, Colin is charged with the crimes. But he says those two actions, one being a crime, one being another, was something he had to carefully consider. And he just was walking through it, like you said, but for this, here's everything that I've considered, because he knows how deeply this affects the community. He says, I've walked alongside many of you over the last 2 years. He's been the judge pretty much since the beginning, overseeing this case and Colt's. So he knows how close this is to the community. He's heard victim impact for both Colt Gray and Colin Gray, and just how changed their lives are, all of the things that they're going to have to live with every single day. Coach Aspinwall's wife really stuck with me, Shayna. She said that young kids don't really understand death. Her 4-year-old daughter keeps asking, when's daddy coming home from football practice? Because she can't process that her dad's gone, that she's never going to have that time. She also looked at Colin and she said, because you chose not to take your son to therapy, I now have to bring my girls to therapy. And that was just, she was just saying, because you did this, these are the choices I made. She goes, I understand how hard it is to be a single parent because you've made me a single parent. I no longer have my husband. I no longer have that option. So just to hear, all of these choices were made to not get help, but the judge was just saying, here's what I think is fair under the law. There's different levels of criminal culpability. He said the lowest level of all of those is criminal negligence, and that's why he felt the 15-year sentence here was appropriate.
Grace, just to follow up, the families were asking for that 80-year maximum sentence and disappointed with the outcome. You were inside court. What reaction, if any, did you see from Colin Gray as he heard the families before the judge came back and as the judge gave the decision of a 15-year prison sentence?
Well, in the courtroom, Colin Gray this morning, he appeared to make eye contact with many of the families as they were talking. He was constantly looking over at them, listening to what he said, listening to what each of them had said. There was one point when the district attorney got up there and he was recounting some of the evidence during the trial, and you could see Colin just kind of shaking his head like, I didn't do that, I didn't do that. You could tell he didn't agree with some of those sentiments, but he was just, he just kind of stared at his sentence was read and just kind of accepted it. We do know that his, legal team, this is the first of its kind, they plan to appeal some of these decisions. So for him, this is the end of the road here in Barrow County. Of course, there's more steps in the future, but he just kind of accepted it. The courtroom was a lot quieter than it was the other day when Colt's sentence was read. It was just kind of that, I think for a lot of families, this belief that he will be out, in the next 10, 15 years.
Grace, what are you hearing about the precedent that this case sets? Because as we know, and we've shared this a couple of times since we've been live, this is the first of its kind here in Georgia, the second of its kind in the country, when you have a parent who is convicted because of the actions of a child. Mm-hmm. I imagine, God willing, we don't have to do it again. But if it does happen again, I imagine that the judges might be looking back at Georgia at this case, looking to Michigan at that case, as they are, prosecuting potentially another parent in the future.
Well, DA Brad Smith, he said the reason they brought this case is that they hope there won't be another case. He says he hopes parents look at this and not even the sentencing, but just the charges and the fact that a jury did convict him on every single count and will think, could this happen to me? Could this happen to me? One thing that really stuck with me from Colin's trial is that Marcy Gray, the mother, at some point had watched the Ethan Crumbley parents documentary. He is the school shooter in Michigan where the parents were convicted. She had looked up what happens to parents, why were the parents charged. So she had that kind of background knowledge in her head leading up to it. Prosecutors say she and Colin had 6 calls after that in an hour. So they were saying, Colin and Marcy knew the risks because they had seen that case. And, that was when Colin started Googling gun safes and other things like that. So they were saying that got them close, not as close as they needed to be to prevent this shooting. But the fact that that thought was even there, if there's more and more of these cases, it might discourage parents, or encourage parents rather, to take precautions to lock up their guns, get their kids help, and just ensure that something like this can't happen with their actions instead of the inaction that we saw here.
Grace King, thank you so much for your coverage. We appreciate it. Know that it's heavy for everybody in the building, including the crews there. Thank you for bringing us the latest here on what is a history-making day in the state of Georgia. Thank you so much.